Welcome to the Link Up Podcast, a joint venture, I would say, with the Ministry of Youth, Sports, Culture, and to be Heritage once again. Thank you guys for joining us as we take a deep dive into the road to emancipation. I have a wonderful panel here with me this afternoon. To my left, to my right, not the usual suspects. For those of you who listen to the Link Up Podcast, you would have caught that joke. I'm going to go to my right. I want to introduce the I'm going to say renowned, because I'm in this studio, the Harquail studio. I think of you. I think of your plays. Think of the work that you've done, the sociology that you've done in the past. The one and only Dr. Frank McField. Welcome to the podcast, or to the panel, I should say.
Well, thank you for welcoming me here, and I thank the minister and the portfolio and those that were responsible for allowing this to happen, because it's so important to happen. And I must start off by being critical in that when we talk about our past, it's like always it has to be perfect. Otherwise, we don't want to talk about it. Now, how are you going to get any healing, and how are you going to get any progress if that's going to be the case? So I'm very happy when even the numbers are small, that there are some that are interested and remain interested in this particular process. I mean, this actual studio theater is here because of the work that I did with Jeff Cresswell and the Cayman National Youth Theater and the Cayman National, and the In Theater, Cayman National Theater Company, and so forth and so on. And when the idea was being pitched, a lot of people didn't understand why it was important to have an inclusive, dramatic society. And the fact that there were people that were not aware of the importance of inclusiveness, and yet they were still talking about equality and democracy and all these things being so perfect here, but they couldn't be inclusive because they were always representing particular types of judgments that had been made by the past. So sometimes we have to go back in history to really understand where these judgments came from. Why is it that we can get along together, or we can live together, we can work together, but we're still judging each other, and therefore we're not creating that synergy, completing that particular kind of human type of bond in a relationship that you really need in a community and that you really need in a nation. Culture, heritage is important, and people continue to mix it up. So maybe we can clarify those things.
100%. I want to continue on to my left. You just took me back to class.
Sorry about that.
I remember doing is it Caymanian history?
Caymanian Society.
Caymanian Society class with you. That was a really good elective that I took. From the BRAC. Can I say from the BRAC? I know we talked about that quite a bit.
From the BRAC.
Yeah, from the BRAC. That was one of your things. Dr. Christopher Williams from UCCI, University College of the Cayman Islands. Welcome to the panel as well.
Thanks for having me, sir.
Teacher calling me sir. That's crazy. I want to get into your class a little bit if we can at some point, and then we can talk about your work that you've done as well. And I remember your infamous debates with Dr. Roy Borden.
Right.
Did slavery exist?
Slave society versus society with slaves.
Yes. Certainly last but not least, the most important person in the panel. I'm in awe of her every time I see her. She's in the finance sector, but she does a really great work with her church. She has some youth work going on over in Africa as well. She has 1,001 jobs, I would say. Miss Latoya Francis, welcome to the panel.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for braving the seat, okay? I know we have your friend coming up as well later on, Miss Katlen Bush. I'm a fan of hers as well. And just some of the great work that you guys have done over the years. So we're going to talk about emancipation. Dr. Frank sort of alluded to it briefly as to addressing your past and sort of, undressing it, I would say, because there is a desire to sugarcoat things and to not fully appreciate where we've come from, and then sort of wonder why we have these sort of struggles or these underlying tones that take place today in society. Yeah. You're taking off the glasses. You getting ready for me?
Well, I'm actually these days in confusion because I discovered AI. And I have, by the time I had discovered AI, I had thousands of manuscripts and pages of manuscripts, and all of a sudden I discovered AI. And so I was talking to AI today about emancipation.
Okay.
And there are people that believe that emancipation is something that takes place on a particular date, and then it's over. We're emancipating ourselves daily. We are liberating ourselves. And I think that there's been so much information around. It's just that most people don't want to sort of access the information or have that kind of dialogue with themselves. Or when you begin to ask yourself, who am I? Who am I? That's a simple sort of philosophical question that you need to get to the roots of who you are. And so if people are making a search, whether or not they're going to stay on the same platform or they're going to change platforms, they should be allowed to do so. And what has happened to this country is this country has a very one-sided view of what should be objective. So they are very subjective about objectivity, because objectivity seems to threaten everybody. Because if you say democracy started at Pedro St. James Castle, democracy, what is democracy then? Is democracy just for the planters, not for the slaves, not for the women, not for the people that don't have land? And so how we define things, it's very important to how we interact. And so part of the problem we have is our interaction is obstructed by our consciousness and the refusal of people, even with new information, to alter their consciousness. So I find myself in terms of what people want to do. They want to honor something, like they want to worship. Emancipation and heritage is not about worshiping, adoring. It's about learning what our mistakes were in the past and how to correct them in the present, and that sort of thing. So that's the particular outlook that I think that a lot of people miss when we're talking about the importance of emancipation, because we're going back to a story that is a story that we have in common with other Caribbean islands. And we can look at ourselves in terms of how we have dealt with that and how the other Caribbean islands have dealt with that. I think from the first time the Africans made the noise when they were free, I think after that, they silenced us.
Okay.
Because we were not just talking about our physical freedom, we were talking about our cultural and spiritual one as well. And these are types of things that you see that we're not able to explore, because people think if we have an interest there, then you have a resentment because it was slavery. So it's like, somebody's carrying a cross on their back. So please don't talk about this, because that means that you hate me. Because people are not remembering properly. Because slavery, our African slavery was not the only evil that happened in the world. When we look at the way the poor Europeans were made slaves before and all that sort of stuff, and unless you get that link with what happened in the Balkans, what we call the Balkans, with the Canaanite people, and what happened with them, until you can get all that together and paste it together, you see that we just came along at a particular time, and it just happened that maybe we have more problems in integrating people to remove that wrong that society had done. And so we just face it, and we can't seem to move beyond it. And I think this is a good start here to be able to see that there's so much positive that you can get out, or studying that, or relating to that whole concept of emancipation and how Caymanians deal with democracy.
Yes. Let me go to Dr. Williams really quickly in terms of his ongoing debate. And talked about Dr. Barton previously. Give me a little bit of context and history as to how that discussion came about and why that was important in terms of the slave history when it comes to Cayman.
Right. So we all know that slavery, as it played out in Cayman, well, in Grand Cayman for the better part of 100 years, slavery was an institution, but it was also atypical, right? So we all know this. Mr. Barton, for instance, who's my friend, and I love him to death. That's kind of a plug for Mr. Barton, right? But Mr. Barton, he seized on that atypical nature to label Grand Cayman 1734 to 1834 as a society with slaves. When I first heard that argument, I did question what he was saying. But it made sense because from 1802, for instance, there were 933 residents in Cayman. 58% of them were slaves. When you compare that demographic to the demographic in Jamaica, it would have been different, right? In Jamaica, slaves always predominated, sometimes up to 90 to 1, right? So I got what he was saying. And in many ways, I agreed with him when he referred to Grand Cayman as a plantocracy and a pigmentocracy, which is to say that in Cayman, the color of your skin determined your place in that hierarchy, that social hierarchy. But then I thought about it some more and I said, but how can you use pigmentocracy and link that to the society with slaves typology, when a pigmentocracy could just as well been a slave society? Because in Cayman, back then, the color of your skin determined your place in society. So if you were of a lighter hue, i.e. white, some people say it near white, right? Then you were at the top. And social hierarchies are pyramidal, so triangular. So these folks at the top, they predominated economically, right? But not numerically. And as you descended the pyramid, the society came darker and darker and darker, until at the very bottom you had the field slaves, right? Who were considered the lowest of the low. And so when I think about Cayman, and when I think about how slaves and masters interacted, right? That interaction wasn't, to hear some people tell it, a kumbaya one, where life was so hard here up to the 1830s that black and white just had to get along, sit by the fireside and sing kumbaya. It didn't work that way. I mean, slaves were here predominantly to be slaves. When you think about slaves, you think about the stripping of one's rights, of one's freedoms. And so in my mind, it's a useful debate, because I think in having that debate, it helps to bring out the nuances that would otherwise miss us.
Yeah, I mean, I think again, it's like we're learning from history, and so if we can get it right, we'll learn much in a much more positive way. But I do understand the difficulties that we had with the definition, because I ran up against that in 1974 with teacher McField. Because when I came back from Germany and I said to him, we had this argument, because I was seeing it much more from a Marxist type of perspective. And of course, he was saying to me that basically it was domestic slavery and so forth and so on. So later on, and that's not too long ago, I came to the conclusion that maybe he was right. And maybe I did understand that Roy comes from that type of generation of teacher McField influences, and that Jamaica experiment there at the University of the West Indies, where they felt that they were a little bit too radical for them, so they had to come down in their economics a little bit, so it didn't get too Marxist. And I think that really I saw Roy bending it to really be able to fit with what would have been the dominant intellectual trend at that time in the Cayman Islands. So by those people who were concerned about it. Now, I don't think that slavery, and I'm going from the history book, Michael Creighton, because Michael Creighton and James Baldwin wrote Jamaican Plantation, which is a history of Worthy Park. James Baldwin happened to have been my tutor in New York, England. He taught me British working class history. So I kind of know where they're coming from in terms of when they're looking at an issue. I was on the history committee, and a lot of the stuff was edited out. His stuff, because you read what he writes about Bahamas, and then you come to Cayman, and you just like to figure, well, what's missing here? But the story that he's trying to tell is how people develop with forced relationships. And this is a very human part. That's why I see it as social history. Because we're talking about the society and how the society is able to manipulate relationships in whatever they have to use in order to be able to get certain benefits for the individuals that are seeking those in this particular situation with the planters. But what happened in the Cayman Islands, because of the fact that they never had a militia, and the fact that they were almost outnumbered, if not outnumbered, sometimes, they had to have a much more gentle way of persuading a person to work for them or not run away from them. So gentle persuasion. And these people were capable of that. And so a kind of respect, and we see that today, and I always tell people, go back and look at Blackie in Cayman Brack and ask yourself, how did a character like that ever come about? I've only heard or read of a character like that in the Cayman Islands, where you have a black man that if you tell him he's black, he's going to shoot you. And so he doesn't have a community that challenges him about this misinterpretation of himself. You know, he has a society that's willing to go along and play along with it. And the white people go along and they play along with it because they allow that. Because it means that we are this kind of paternalistic type of situation that they would not have developed on a much larger scale plantation. Work regiment definitely was much different, I believe, because they never had that same kind of control. And when you look at Caymanian workers today, and you see their tradition, you can understand that when you compare them against a Jamaican or Trinidadian or Bajan. Caymanians don't work the same. They always they're working for themselves. And once you hit the pride part, then you got enemy. You can't force them. You know.
Expound. Give me more on that. Go ahead. Expound on that for me. Give me some more on that.
Yeah, because it's a psychological bonding that comes up between the master and the slave, where the slave is emulating the master, which is going to happen in any kind of slave system, whether or not there's white or blacks involved in it. And in this particular situation, they are allowed to do it because it becomes a part of the social control mechanism. So they have to employ much more psychology and diplomacy rather than having a strong foreman them that can come and call it down and whoop them, you know.
Yeah.
And so it had to be done a little different in that sense. Not saying that there's a stock pattern, but it's much more variation in terms of how the reaction of power is when it's challenged.
Still taking place today in this
and it's still in place today. Watch it in this election that just went by. The same thing. I mean, it just brings it back to me. I mean, I never thought it could replay itself that way, but it did.
Cool. Dr. Frank, so when I think about history, when most people, or when a lot of people think about history, they more or less see it as dead. Yep. But in my mind, I think that history is with us. It's ongoing. And I dare say that history's culmination more or less translates to the Western world, right? So we in Cayman, we're Westerners, right? And when you think about the West and the fact that we still abide by Western rules, Western norms, etc., I have to look back into history there. And so while I understand that, the nature of slavery in Cayman was different, I think about people like Long Celia, who tried to buck that trend, right? She tried to buck it, and what happened to her? She was lashed, okay? Not only that, but I think about Hannibal and Primus, the first deportee slaves, right? They were deported for doing what? For practicing obeah. So it sort of comes back to what you say, right? There was always that mechanism to ensure that these, may I use the word nigger, right? But to ensure that these black people, right, were constantly, perpetually kept in their place.
Yeah, but they were kept in. And you're saying that, you see, because even when we're talking here, I don't feel comfortable talking about race in Cayman.
For a reason.
I mean, at my age, I still, because it's like you don't know what your audience is, because we don't have a common consciousness when it comes to these issues, and they have prevented it from developing, where we could say, hey, this is how we understand this, this is how we're going to negotiate with this challenge that we have in our society, in our politics, in our economics. Yeah. And I was trying to be a little bit forward thinking when we did this theater project with Jeff Cresswell. Because when I came back as a sociologist, we recognized that they had already started with the Drama Society in terms of saying, hey, you guys don't speak like we do, you don't really behave like, we don't really want to hang out with you, right? So we created something that was different, and it was all inclusive, and it was much more dynamic because it was multi-everything, and that was where the wave was at that particular time. Nobody came here looking to segregate themselves. Everybody came here looking to learn what was here, about what was here and who was here. And so we started building on that particular premise, the whole idea of Caymankind tourism. Again, if you come, you'll see that the kind of ways in which Caymanians greeted the tourists. And if you read Time Longer Than Rope and Ella's relationship with Mr. Weiler, and that whole thing it's her relationship with Catherine, for instance, to Catherine, Mr. Weiler's wife, and the empathy that they both share with each other and so forth. It's showing that there is not the discrimination the same amount. That it is something that makes it different. Okay, now what happens is the warning is that this is going to change, because Mr. Weiler is going to change it, because he's going to take it and he's going to make money off of it. And so once the money comes in, then there's another dynamic that is at play. There's no longer the whole idea of hospitality and so forth and so on. So I thought that in looking at the Caymanian personality and watching people how they serve, for instance, in the early days, I was old enough at that time as a boy to really be able to see how people treated you. It was not as if it was a one-way mentality. I went to the Presbyterian church, and it was not something that was made into law. You see, when you have, for instance, segregation, like how America had segregation, that's a completely different thing, because what they do, they institutionalize a particular thing. Those relationships are therefore no longer just left to the flow in economics and the way that might change social relationship and social behavior. Because you got to remember now that here sometimes these planters didn't have anything. Yeah, they didn't have anything, and they might need to get some bread kind from their servants, their slaves. And the good slaves would go and give master this, and master would be happy and blah, 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 blah. And we saw the continuation of this in my generation when we were dealing with what we call Georgetown Central. And you ask a question, for instance, how come those people in Georgetown Central so important and so important? I mean, they were the most important people. If they say this is going to happen in the election, this is going to happen in the election. Okay. So the way in which power was shared in the Caymanian context is obviously different. And I think it has to do with the economics.
Let me ask, though, you mentioned, because I felt your pain when you said it. You said you don't really feel comfortable talking about race, even to now. I want to be a little optimistic. I'd hope to be optimistic. Are platforms like this, focusing on Emancipation Week, are things like this shifting and helping the situation?
Well, I think that these things should be ongoing. I think in the classes, because once you tell people it's about learning what you did wrong, so that you can do it right. I mean, that's what history is for, to me anyway. I'm not using history to go prosecute anybody. I'm using history to learn how to be a better person, because we all know that human beings are not perfect. So when we read history, I mean, there's the history where people try to dress it up, but people like me, we are critical analysts, so we are going to try to get to the part behind that part to
the
be able.
Underbelly of it.
Yeah, underbelly. Yeah. Let me check in on my friend over here. I have not come to you.
It's okay, but I do have a question as I'm listening to Dr. Frank and Dr. Chris. When I think about history, yes, it is important. I'm a firm believer that you can't know where you're going unless you understand where you came from. And as a Caymanian, and I also feel your pain, because that's something when you said about, it's still hard to talk about race in Cayman. I remember when I came back from London in, I think that was 2017, 2018, and we were excited about what we were doing with Let Me Live before that. And I was speaking to someone very high in government, and I was telling them, we had conversations around colorism in Cayman, and we had a really good turnout. And I was told point blank, "Oh, Cayman doesn't have a race issue." And as a young Caymanian, it kind of rocked me, because I went, with a lot of energy, thinking I'm gonna get the support. We're gonna, and again, the issue is not to have any kind of victimhood mindset, but actually create spaces for healing and for people to understand their identity. So as you're speaking about, history, I think for me, it's really important as well for us to also, if I'm looking at history, it's important for me to see what my present looks like in the lens of history. And I would be interested to hear what both your takes are when we look at what the Cayman society looks like today. How does that play into the history that we were talking about?
Right. So, as I said before, history isn't dead. It's not dead, right? And absent the structural segregation that would have existed in America or even South Africa, there's still historical, or there are still cues that will take us back into our Caymanian history, and sort of, if we choose to follow them or acknowledge them, they will open our eyes. I mean, I don't know if I should say this. I'm a bit irreverent at times.
Say it.
But there was a certain politician way back in the day, I won't say when, right? Unless you guys, hone in, who more or less said that the color black is only good for shoes and never people. Right? So I guess, and I also know, I'm speaking to certain older Caymanians, that racism was an issue here.
Yep.
And while segregation wasn't as structured, you go to Cayman Brack of yesteryear, for instance.
Yeah, but
right, the West Enders, those were the ones who were of lighter hue. Right, I know I shouldn't be saying these things, right? And according to a respondent of mine, there was a tree in the district of Creek, Cayman Brack, and anything east of that tree, right? Anyone who lived east of that tree took on the nigger suffix. So if you're from Spot Bay, you're a Spot Bay nigger, Creek nigger. And so while that segregation of which you speak, it was absent enough, I still think that there are cues that we can that we should take to heart, and we should all acknowledge them, because the problem is many people believe that wokeness is bad to be woke, right? It's bad to be so race conscious. And you black people, oh, you have great big chips on your shoulders, and forget about that. But I dare say, to your point, that without understanding where we're coming from and the dirty parts of it, there's no change.
Yeah, but
There's no growth.
yeah, but I think that this is one of the reasons why I said I had a difficulty from the very beginning with Roy's position versus your position. And many of the students at the university came to me and to ask me because they were confused, you know? And I think it's that who, as a participant observer, so I trained in sociology a little different. I would just sit and read books. I was in the field, and I had to deal with different types of people. I think that structure and how something is structured, and then they have the gatekeepers, or they have the way of keeping it that way. It wasn't so here from my explanation, because if somebody white wanted to say something bad about me, they're going to wait until I leave, and they're going to say it behind my back. They're not going to say it to my face, okay? In America, they're going to say it in your face. They're going to put a gun in your face, or they put a broken ketchup bottle, as happened to me, in my face, and tell me what they want to tell me, and then walk away. So the way people deal with differences, that they are perceived differences between them, the obvious differences between them, the way in which the society has treated those differences and organized those differences, we're different. Because one of the things that I learned in America is that black people in America spend more time policing black people on the white side than the whites men. So Jim Crow just didn't survive by itself. By white people keeping it, there had to be black people keeping it as well. So you have to have the two sides in the agreement. Otherwise, one side will not be successful. In Cayman, and I always say, that's one of the reasons why Scranton is so important, because they used to call it Sorry Bush, and they used to call it Monkey Town, and all kinds of derogatory terms that when we use them today, people say, oh my God, how could you refer to people as monkeys? But they were talking about black people. But yet again, in their vocabulary, they were even able, in their paternalistic type of attitude towards social control, they would sit and people laugh with them when they call them these things. And so they would win, black people would win their favor by taking that kind of abuse. So when Norbert Thompson would say something to them out there, or whatever it is, when they used to be out there by the post office and places like that, out where the merchants are, and then women would go out there like my Aunt Belle and different people like that, the way they would act and everything like that. And they would act in a very derogatory term against their own self. They would ridicule themselves. They would demean themselves to a certain extent in front of the master, the boss.
To win favor.
And they would get favors from them. Whereas if you hold your head up and acted like you were a gentleman, you would get the problem.
But isn't paternalism the issue here? The fact that paternalism, as immaterial as it may seem, it does generate experiences. It does generate reality. So if the white man is being paternalistic, isn't that going to result in a legacy if it's not checked? If white men and black men don't come to the table, as Frantz Fanon said?
Yes.
So, I mean, I guess that's my point. My point is that while segregation, I mean, you really can't compare the two, right? Segregation, quote unquote, in Cayman versus segregation in the US. But there is something called racial legacy. And I dare say that that legacy is with us. it's with us in terms of a black person who will say something like, I don't want my kid marrying a black person, right? Because I want grandkids with pretty hair, whatever that means. Yeah. So I don't know. I get what you're saying, and I agree with you.
Because what I'm saying really is just what you said.
Right.
You're encouraged. The miscegenation is encouraged. Because you got to remember now in the history, it's saying that the white man could marry the white woman, or the mulatto woman, the colored woman, or the black woman, and the colored man could marry the colored woman or the black woman, but the black man could only marry the black woman. So when you see that kind of behavior in your society, you see how things are being set up. Mm-hmm. Because they're actually using race as a tool of social control. And how they manipulate it depends upon how little physical force they have available. That fear.
Psychological. Yeah.
Right. So if my grandfather, like Lemon McField, for instance, like he was saying to, I remember when my father got in some problems after the Second World War. He was serving in Trinidad, and he stabbed up a police from, there used to be a friend of his when he was a police, Captain Erdis. My father stabbed him, almost killed him. And then Roddy Watler, who was a big policeman at that particular time, had to go to arrest my father, right? And my father had just come back from the Navy in Trinidad, and my grandfather told him that he couldn't come into the yard because my grandfather had a gun. So when he felt that he was going to give him his son, he would tell him. Other than that, he would have to wait. Now, this is exactly how this country was structured. That there were these black men there that these white men respected to an extent because of the fact of violence. Yeah. My Uncle Farmer, and he was a gunman. You know, he had his guns. The McField people, they had his gun. They had their square. It was McField Square. And nobody really could go over a particular point. Now, in other countries, when you have that particular kind of behavior, you'll bring in somebody from someplace else and say, hey, look, I think I can't trust these people. We need to get rid of them now. But they obviously knew how far these people would go with their threat. And so how they balanced power was very, very unique. Mm. It was not possible in other places like the way it was here. You see it in the elections. You see it in the elections. The Cayman elections are just like that. How these people do this, it's the same way. It's under the table. It's no organized consciousness, but yet there's conscious behavior and so forth and so on. So you have to guess about it. You don't really know about it, but you know that something is different here. And I think that's what I had to accept the fact that the Cayman Islands is different than other Caribbean islands. And I mean, people in the Caribbean, like Roy Gibbons, I think, when he saw what I was writing, for instance, and different things like that, he was surprised that a Caymanian would be talking like that, writing like that, you know. And so most Caribbean islands don't expect a consciousness from us that is explainable through their viewpoints. But because this is the whole point. Without the understanding that the racial divisions and the racial differences was based upon economics and for the purpose of economics, you don't get no place with this because Caymanians just won't see that. How people are treated, how race is used is because of economics and not for any other reason but that.
Welcome back to the Link Up Podcast. I wanted to switch out the guest for a second. Dr. Williams will join us another time as we do a Q&A session just for the panel. But I wanted to bring on Katlen really quickly to talk about the grassroots, the movement to bring back Emancipation Day, some of your motivations and as to why. I know you as a poet. I actually saw you on this stage a few weeks ago, pouring your heart out and sharing your art. You're very vocal. I know you're a critical thinker. Tell me about your involvement with Emancipation Day and how it came about.
Thank you so much, Victor, for that. Firstly, I want to say thank you to the Ministry of Youth and heritage and sports for all their hard work in planning these events on a national scale. That's no easy task. And all of our islands being included, I really appreciate that. And even the work that it took before the reinstatement to do the research and present cabinet papers, like all the sacrifices. I want to thank the ministry for that. We want to acknowledge also Dr. Frank and Dr. Chris, our educators, our trailblazers who have taught us so much, fully supported our movement, and their work and their publications in history and sociology of Cayman has really informed our work as well. I also want to recognize and highlight the Caymanian women that have trailblazed for us and inspired us and never let us forget our roots. You know, I think of Miss Anita Ebanks, the former museum director, and how she wrote a paper on our Caymanian African heritage in the 80s. And I think of Miss Nasaria Sakushalet, who has dedicated her life work and art to honoring our African ancestors. And whenever I would go to the Bordentown Heritage Museum, which is like right across from the Mission House, it's called Nurse Josie Center, Miss Mary Lawrence would show me a picture of some of the last enslaved Caymanians and even tell me a little bit about their descendants. And the last person, our peer and colleague, our friend, Dr. McCanna Scott, who has been a huge advocate as well. And I've learned so much working alongside of her. I've also learned so much working alongside of Latoya and Casey Mobley from the Let Me Live organization. And I love their community approach. And it felt like a safe space every time I would enter the conversation. It felt like a safe space for me to grow and learn. And so I really respected them. And so we have our co-founder here, Latoya. And so I'm going to let her share more about the background of what we did.
Thanks, Katlen. So this would have been in 2017. We came back from university, just really passionate about wanting to work in the community, living in the US. I feel like we got to experience race in a way where, this is going to sound very weird, I felt like coming back from the US and coming back home was really a way for us to see ourselves in a different light. I grew up in Jamaica as well. I will say that experience of being in Jamaica and coming to Cayman as well was different for me, because in Jamaica I didn't feel like I was Black. I wasn't reminded I was Black. Cayman, through primary school, high school, it was something that was, constantly reminded that I was different because of the way that I looked. And so when Casey and I came back from university, we really wanted to foster an environment that was gonna, one, give us the space and the freedom to explore that, to bring about just a healthy environment, one, for healing, to discuss the things that we would have experienced. And so from that, Casey's sociology background also played a huge role in the way that we would have, in the way that we would have organized discussion forums that we had. So we started out first with having discussion forums around what was happening in the US. So when Black Lives Matter and the shootings of Trayvon Martin happened, we found that there was a lot of people in our community that had questions but didn't have a safe space to speak about that. So we started having, just those discussion forums for that. We also had discussions on colorism, as I mentioned earlier, talking about, one, how that shows up in our everyday lives, and how, as Caymanians, looking at, one, yes, history, but being accountable in the way that we handle it going forward. And for sure, we were inspired by the work of Dr. Roy Bawden, Dr. Frank, Dr. Chris, just the way that you guys have created a space for us to learn about our history, even though it wasn't talked about. I felt like we went through like years of not hearing about it, and knowing that we did have scholars in Cayman who were, one, just academics that we could look up to and emulate, was also really important for us in this movement.
And it was through listening to our educators and our community members that we decided to host an Emancipation poetry event in 2021. And we chose the avenue of poetry and art because we feel like there's so many different emotions that people feel when they think about slavery. A lot of our local poets and artists were talking about the immense grief that comes. And, Dr. Williams mentioned it earlier, the separation of your family, the human trafficking involved, the sexual violence, and all these different aspects of grief that we feel, that our ancestors felt, that we can't even imagine what they had to go through. But also the joy that our ancestors showed in the resilience. And we spoke about it earlier with Longcelia, how her words were so powerful that it threatened a whole system, that 50 lashes, even though at the time it was only supposed to be 39, that was the allowed amount, but she endured 50 lashes. And Dr. Williams spoke about Primus and Hannibal and how they used their spirituality to fight back, and just how our ancestors tried to retain their humanity as much as they could, and how we have to continue those stories to honor their perseverance and how it continues within us. And as I'm thinking about the resilient Caymanian spirit, I'm thinking, and we were talking earlier about segregation, I'm thinking about the story that I learned in Dr. Williams' class, and the well-known story that I saw in the Bottomtown Museum as well on Andrew Malcolm, and how he refused to segregate his class after emancipation. And he was so harassed by the former slave owners that he had to leave. And the Black people in Bottomtown, they petitioned, even though they couldn't write at the time, they petitioned for their right to education. And so that kind of resilient spirit has to be preserved, has to be passed down, because that is what makes us Caymanian. And so we chose poetry, we chose art, and we had book clubs as well, because like Dr. Frank said, it's not a one-time thing. Emancipation is a lifelong journey of learning. And so that's why I so appreciate the Emancipation Center that is now in town. That Emancipation Center where people can go and study and reflect throughout the year, because it's not a one-time thing. So
I want to commend you, ladies. First off, coming back from university, like you said, having that sort of passion and that energy, and figuring out where to channel it, and then not getting discouraged as well, because that's a real thing. I think it's happened to a lot of us. To see where the grassroots movement has now taken us. I appreciate the day off as well, the public holiday, but in the grand scheme of things, I think it's just an important sort of milestone and movement for us and it came on going forward. Dr. Frank, I see you here with your notes.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that, I wrote down something that it says that true wisdom does not come from glorifying the past. True wisdom comes from examining it honestly. We honor our ancestors not by covering up the hard truths, but by learning from them and by committing ourselves to do better. And it's one of the issues that I had with this country for 48 years, because I was taught in America certain things. I was taught in England certain things. I was taught in Germany certain things. Nobody tried to stifle me, silence me, punish me. I was rewarded. I had good scholarships all the way. And coming back here to the Cayman Islands, I was invited back. I was brought back here by Thomas Russell, because he had been in the German prisoner of war camp. And he understood if I came from their training that I would have to have some idea. And what I was hired for was because if I left here at 15 years old 15 and a half years old in 1964, and I'm coming back now, I think I'm 27, there are a lot of things that I'm going to remember. So when it comes to the social issues, I'm not going to forget about the root part of it. People are just going to be looking at here, and I'm going to be looking all the way down here. I'm going to go back to my childhood and see things through those lenses as well. So I think that was helpful. That was one of the reasons why I got into the problem about the weakness in the family structure. And therefore, I started to say we needed early childhood education rather than the middle schools. And I fought that battle. So it is about the fact that we never had the same kind of respect for higher education that they had in Jamaica and Barbados and the other plantocracies that were more successful. And so if you say something, I mean, we were called educated fools. People like Steve McField was called an educated fool. And so they would never call a white person an educated fool. So the racism in terms of what racism achieves or what it sets out to achieve in different environments, it's different. You see, how are we playing this here today? I mean, and I am so happy for those persons who fought to bring back Emancipation Day before this government, now that is elected. I am happy because if that chance had not been taken, if that had not been done, Emancipation Day would never come back to Cayman. I listened to the present premier, talk at their first Emancipation Day thing. And he went to a black school, obviously, in America, and he had issues with these things and blah, 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 so forth and so on. There's some of us that just have issues with it because it's when you deny the possibility for people to have to go through the particular process of healing that they need to go through just by knowing. That's what happened. We're not talking about people hating people and people going back, but people need to really become conscious in all these ways. And the fact that African spirituality was so powerful here, because the Africans were many when emancipation happened that were still using their African names. And they were using the African spirituality, the fact that it was so obvious in this country, and the fact at the same time that it's so hidden.
Yeah.
It was so obvious that the white people themselves were using African spirituality. And so I think that we're, as a culture, and when we come to the whole idea of talking about heritage and culture, we need to get to the point to understand what heritage is and how it's different from culture, and people need to be able to have these things. And the only way that's going to happen if the ministry has a more of what would you say outreach programs. It's not something that you can just kind of wait for Emancipation Day and wait until Emancipation Day and then have something on it. This have to be things in schools and all of that.
But before we wrap and go to some questions from the audience, I wanted you to touch on that because that was something I always struggle with people, culture versus heritage. Give that to me really quickly in a nutshell.
Well, I mean, the heritage is like, I would say it's like the roots or the pillar. It is what got you there. Mm-hmm. The culture is what you're now practicing as a result of the heritage.
Ever-changing.
So when we talk about Cayman heritage, and a lot of people are, when we say, how could you, if you forgot about emancipation and you're talking about heritage, how could that work? How could it work? How could a society benefit from any kind of light that would come from truth when they have hidden the most light by making it dark, by denying it? The fact was that it was not just about being slaves. It was also about what our families could pass on. And I know that my family passed on to me genes that are very spiritual. And it has haunted me a lot in my life because of that spirituality. And that was something that I could not move away from. I could not deny. And I think that it is a testament, a positive testament to the Cayman Islands, that it does have this very strong African spiritual presence. And when we talk about hospitality, and I always remember Dale Ramon telling me this story, that he said that his mother, Miss Francis, Ramon told him that any time that he bring anybody to that yard, as soon as they pass the fence, the gate, they become part of the family. That is as African as it comes. And I had to tell that to Kenneth. I said, look, That area is important. They might have called it Monkey Town or whatever, but those people were very communal, very proud, and very strong. And we need to be able to give the children in school that kind of feeling, because I have the feeling sometimes if you have Jamaican teachers teaching Caymanian children, it's different than if you have Jamaican teachers teaching Jamaican teachers, because the Jamaican teachers are going to teach from the plantation method, and when they teach the Caymanian child like that, the Caymanian child get upset. The Caymanian child retreats, goes into itself, start creating his own thing in his class, and blah, 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 blah. So if they knew that in terms of their pedagogy, if they knew that, and I'd been trying to point that out to them from the very beginning, the Caymanian child is coming with a pride. The Jamaican child is coming humble, and is going to act humble even if it don't want to be humble, because it knows it's going to get a benefit. And when we look at that, and we look at how important it is to rediscover the kind of influence which African heritage had on the Caymanian. And I'm talking about in one of Roy Boyden's books, he writes about the thing about the women going to East End when they fight for the U.S. sailor or whatever it is, and they end up at the same Obia place. I think when you read things like that, hey, that's telling you a lot about the spiritual influence that they had, because you remember now, these other people didn't have any churches until very late.
What I would say to Dr. Frank, and you brought up so much in what you said, like we have such a rich heritage and our young people are longing for it. Our young people so want it. And I think that's one of the things that inspired our movement too, just based on what we were seeing on social media. Like they want to know this history, because if we erase Cayman being a young nation, if we erase any part of our history, we are losing a major part of our identity. And the children, the young people are feeling it. And I want to say that in the schools, there are hardworking teachers, regardless of nationality, who are educating themselves and want to pass down this knowledge, but they don't know where to look, because sometimes it's hard to find it. It's hard to dig it up. And I think about the CNCF teacher socials that I've been to, where I hear the teachers talking about they want these resources. And so I'm so glad that the ministry is providing these resources now. And also, like when you were talking earlier about how in terms of there's so much I want to say so much I want to respond to you on, but when you're talking so much about just that rich history being passed down and that heritage, and talking about Obia and that spirituality, it's so rich. And I just think about how even when it comes to Miss Cicely, and when I was looking at the Cayman National Archives, how she had to, in her church, she had to fight for the right to sit at the front of the church because she was segregated to the back. And so all these stories that we have, we need to pass them down, and our young people need to hear it. And so I'm so glad you brought up that point.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Yeah, just to add on to that as well. And thank you, Katlen, for that, because as Dr. Frank was talking, one of the words that I wrote down was identity. I do think that, and Dr. Chris said it earlier, history is still with us here. It's not dead. And so for me and the work that I do with young people, it's really important to talk about history, but also to look at what's coming in the future. So I love the conversation that we're having. I guess for me, what I would like to see more of is talking about examining our society as it is today, and now looking at, because when we think about, even earlier, Dr. Frank, you talked about, one of the main, I guess you would say, backbones of slavery is the economic side of things. And I think for me as a young Caymanian woman who work in the corporate sector in Cayman, when you look at what a lot of these partners look like, they don't look like what Cayman looked like. And I think that is very important for us to consider in this conversation of identity. Because even when you said earlier that, the difference between how a Caymanian child would react juxtaposed to a Jamaican kid, what I'm seeing is not that Caymanian children are reacting with pride. I'm seeing Caymanian students reacting from a place of mediocrity and feeling like they're not enough because they don't know who they are. And so I do think that the next chapter, and I really just want to send big ups to Miss Tunisia for all of the hard work that, you know, she's been doing behind the scenes from last year, you know, with the different events, and just also including us in the conversation. It really means a lot to us. But I think for me, the next chapter that I want to say is, okay, how do we then get the youth plugged? And you talked about elections that just happened recently. Yeah. How do we get the generation coming up now plugged into thinking about what our society looks like currently and what it can look like if we apply what we know about the history?
Yeah.
Yes, because to be a historically informed person is also to be a politically informed person, because you know the roots of these issues, you know the context, and you know how our ancestors, what they did to overcome, and we can then innovate to continue that legacy.
I wanna get us some Q&A real quick from the audience, just in case, and leave us there on that note. But I also want to say that Caitlin was invited to the Link Up podcast, and I want to put you on the spot a little bit. You're doing well. You're doing wonderful.
And you are awesome. The Link Up podcast has grown so much.
I don't give you my flowers.
You're a voice for the culture, for the youth, for the community. I really appreciate it.
And I bring it up because I think people like Latoya and yourself are going to be needed to help move that conversation forward in terms of this current state of young people and getting them forward. I'm gonna give you.
I was just going to say that I've been actually preparing some stuff. And I mean, we have a minister now in the portfolio that's handling both things, because I was very concerned about the splitting of the heritage and the culture. I complained about it, and so forth. Now that we have it back together, we have people that can help, because you have all the facilities, you have everything that you can work with the young people. There's the National Youth Theater again. Let's have these things, but I am so happy. And Katlen, you know, I have always respected your ability to read and to comprehend. And I mean, you're just much further ahead than most people. And I'm so happy that you got the two of you, you know, that are interested. And there really is, you have the building block now. I'm serious, and I will do whatever I can do to help to encourage and to write. I quite have a few proposals. We want to bring back the Cayman National Theatre Company. One, I got a call from Clifton Hunter School saying that they got time longer than Robin Downside up his books. Now, after 3 years, you know, Miss Julie bought it 3 years ago, and they just got there. So we know what we're dealing with. Not easy.
Thank you, Dr. Frank. I want to go into really quick if there's any questions in the audience. I'm going to let Chris do some work behind the scenes. I see. Okay, we have one. Lady in white. Round of applause for Chris, everybody. Round of applause. Yay. It's not a Link Up episode if I don't make fun of Chris. It's just how we love each other.
Hi, everybody. This show is really great. I'm curious if any of the panel have read Defining the Caymanian Identity. It's sitting somewhere in the museum. And I think it discusses a lot of modern versus traditionalist ideas on who we are as Caymanians. And I'm curious on your take and how we've evolved past the publication of that book, if anyone has read it.
Should we give Chris the vote? Chris, you're smiling. Give us a little bit of history. Go ahead, come on. Let me give Chris a mic. This is Dr. Chris Williams, by the way.
Thank you. So, I wrote that book, unfortunately.
Yeah.
All right. So I'll tell you a bit of why I wrote it. It was actually, I was about to do my PhD. And as you guys may or may not know, I am from Jamaica originally, but I never lived there. So I was born in Jamaica, and then I was whisked away to Cayman Brac. And I grew up in Cayman Brac. And life was kind of strange in Cayman Brac, right? I came face to face with my race, right? I remember being at a certain primary school. I shall not say the name of the school. And I was playing outside, and a Caymanian child referred to me as something that I will not say. Okay? And so I kind of went through life thinking, okay, I'm different. But yet some people see me as Caymanian. So can I identify as Caymanian? Can I? And of course, some folks would say no, because you have that great big Jamaican accent. And others would say, yes, you can, because you've lived here and you have the island's best interests at heart. So I wrote that from a place of, excuse my phraseology here, voyeurism. Actually, I was both an insider and an outsider. And by virtue of being an outsider, I could actually look at what was going on and able to, I think, objectively assess. Right? So I came up with this idea that, the Cayman identity is very contested. It's contested between competing notions that center around nationality, for instance, that center around one's perception of history, for instance. And so I don't know what has been done since then, but that's what I was thinking when I wrote it.
Cayman Brack. I'm going to tell you a story about Cayman Brack. A little girl in Cayman Brack, this lady Leslie Beagleman, she was from America, and she was doing some art classes in Cayman Brack at the school. And one of the little girls paint the other one of the little girls, and she must have painted her looking like she was too dark. And the little girl went home to her mother crying, saying that that's not how she looks. She's not black. And her mother came back to the school and demanded that they change that picture because her daughter is not black. I mean, for you to have grown up in Cayman Brack, that to me was a nightmare. I could never have done that. So I have to congratulate you that you did it and you're still sane. You still know who you are. No.
Just to give him his props too, we have some really good classes at UCCI with Dr. Williams. So if you ever get a chance to take a class with him, I suggest you do that. Is there any other questions from the audience?
Yes. I'm really enjoying the discussion. I think it's way overdue, and I'm so proud of this generation for bringing it to the front. I remember Tunisia and I are around the same age, and I remember I did history in O-levels in high school, and I topped it because I loved history. I'm a historian, but I did law in the end. Then I was going to do my A-levels, and they gave me the curriculum, and I didn't see West Indian history on the curriculum. And I asked the then head of history, well, where is West Indian history? Oh, they don't do that, I was told. And I was really, really upset because at the age of 16, I was craving to want to know who am I? So, who am I? Thankfully, my parents had the ability to say to me, what do you want to do? Do you want to go to Jamaica? Do you want to go to Trinidad? And I said yes, because I couldn't fathom having to go to do my A-levels to study history, and I couldn't even study from the country and the region that I came from to know all of the peoples over the ages that brought me into being, right? So the question I have is, what is there a curriculum in the high schools and the primary schools to deal with Caymanian history and also our wider Caribbean history, particularly around the subject of slavery and migration, etc.? That's a question I have, because the issues that Dr. Frank is talking about, the issues that you are talking about how our children and how our people interact and behave, I think a lot of it comes from the inner struggle of figuring out who you are and getting that sense of confidence to walk through this life.
Thank you so much for sharing your story, and thank you for your question. You'll be glad to know that there is a curriculum in the high schools that studies Cayman history. So from years 7 to 9 in the public high schools, they will be studying Caymanian history from settlement, slavery, emancipation, post-emancipation, World War I and World War II, and Caymanian involvement in those wars. And even tonight, as we think about the veterans event that's happening tonight, you know, our students will be empowered with that knowledge as well. And then they have the option of choosing Caribbean history. And so they go even deeper, and sometimes there's a disconnect with Cayman and the Caribbean and the way we teach it. And that is, I feel like, sometimes intentional, but I think we need to get back to that wider regional context, because that is also important to study in that.
Yes.
I just wanted to confirm that I did study West Indian history in the end. I ended up going to do my A-levels in Trinidad.
Yeah.
And the irony was that I didn't want to even take me there because I had not done O-level history. But I enjoyed that opportunity and I absorbed myself. And I was so privileged. And one of the things I want to say is that I hope that the information at the archives can become more easily accessible to the general public, right? Because we need to collaborate with our public libraries and the information the archives have. Because the archives is not, I will say it's not fit for purpose in the 21st century. The government needs to invest in it.
Well said. So,
Yeah, Dr. Frank, you made mention of examining and learning from the past, right? And committing to doing better. And taking what Latoya made mention of, the feeling or sense of worth, self-worth, or even value, and thinking about the experiences that we have with our young people and how they see themselves. I'm wondering, in terms of the historical issue of what people experience as relates to work, as relates to somewhat of an importance, is it possible that some of our policies exasperate the issue by, yes, they may not necessarily feel worthy of, and may not necessarily feel that they can participate in, but is it possible that some of the decisions that we make, whether from a national perspective or even in our corporate sector, does somewhat hinder our young people from participating? We may have people like Ms. Bothwell and Latoya and myself that may have grit and go through it anyway, but there's a lot of our people that may not necessarily have that.
Well, I think, thanks for that, really, because, I mean, I've known you for a long time. I've known your parents. And I have always been conscious of the struggle that people have because of race and Cayman. Everybody mostly have to deal with it because it's so secret. It's so personal. It is not as structured as in other places. And so it's very personal because it's almost like you don't really know, but you know. And so what to do? I found that, and I tried to tell them this, like with tourism, you know, with Caymanian working in tourism. I said to Caymanian, if you tell him to do something and you tell him in the wrong way, he's going to say that's disrespect. So he's going to walk off the job. He's going to stand up to you. He's not going to say, oh, boss, well, tell me how you really want it done and I'll do it, you know? And I always compare the Jamaicans on the job to the Caymanians on the job, and we see all the differences. But because people could look at that and they say, well, maybe we're entrapped in a way. We're entrapped, psychologically entrapped. We're like trying to come out of the hole, but we're not really getting out of there because there's never that reinforcement, that kind of grouping that is necessary, that kind of synergy that is necessary to get people out of this. in the gangs that I studied, and the sessions that I studied, and different things like that I've studied over the years, I watched them move themselves out and create an identity. But normally that identity becomes so much of an outsider identity that it's very hard to bring it back in again. And the government has never had the good sense to say, hey, if somebody can talk to them and get down to their level, they can get them back. You can bring them back slowly to where they're willing to take guidance and things from people who are really sort of moving them towards work in particular areas. And it's something that our pride as Caymanians is so amazing that we would be like, we say we cut off our nose to spite our face. So when you have that kind of reaction happening in your society, you imagine how many youth them that you're piling up that get on the streets and getting ready to, that they're so alienated. We have tried our best to say the psychology and sociology of the Caymanians are different. Go east end, go north side, and witness it. Look how their districts are today in relationship to our districts in Georgetown. All our neighborhoods are now commercialized, central Georgetown. Well, look at East End. It's different because those people go outright and reject anyone coming to persuade them that change is beneficial to them. Until they make the decision to change, you can't change them. And so when we understand the psychology that we're dealing with, we'll have a different approach. And this is one of the reasons why labor, in terms of there being no labor unions, no kind of mechanisms to introduce these people, encourage these people, give them the protection they need, that they deserve, and that maybe that is denied to them. So we're not really focusing enough on grassroots psychology and sociology. We're just making one blanket thing and said, this is how the world is and this is how people are supposed to be. And here you have all these people in the Cayman Islands with an identity that I haven't even figured out yet, really. And we're coming in, we're just pushing everything on it. So I think that what we need to do is just become a little bit more honest about talking about our challenges, because they're real challenges as part of social growth. We're willing to accept it at that and go forward by giving people opportunities over and over again if necessary, until we get them into the system that we believe that they need to be in order to survive and make a life for themselves.
Well,
the unfortunate truth is that racism, discrimination is so subtle, right? And very difficult to put a handle on as it relates to recourse. Because, like, for example, I've FOI'd various positions I've applied for. And there are different times when I've gotten different responses, and they're not necessarily good. And if I was to write a book, it wouldn't necessarily put a lot of people in Cayman in a good light. How do we reconcile knowing that the person who you went to school with, or the person whose family to your family, are the ones who are sometimes the gatekeepers, the HR managers, the gatekeepers of employment. I go to a lot of the HR conferences in Cayman, and I look at the gatekeepers. Yeah, how do you reconcile that? I know you from we were in school, and walk on.
Well, that's it. Yeah, that would work. Was that a question or an answer?
I think she was just had to state her piece, man. So I have a special guest coming to join.
No, one of the things that I feel that what we really need to do is, speaking honest like this, is a beginning where we could talk about the fact that there is discrimination And if it's not discrimination, then it's terrible misunderstanding of people and how people see their own dignity, and the fact that some people don't have no respect for the way we see our dignity. And I mean, I spent enough time on the street with the little guys with the guns and all that to really understand some things. You know, they take it serious. They take it serious. Their dignity, they take it serious. And so sometimes when mothers get their sons back off the street and where they put down the guns and go back home, it's some of the most happy days for those parents, because these young people, they are, when they say no, they mean no. When they say they're going to do this and they get in all of this kind of problem, it is all because of misunderstanding on the job, the disrespect and the discrimination that they feel. Now, if we're saying there's no discrimination in this country, and they're feeling it so much that they prefer to walk the street without something, then got to be something wrong. So we see how labor, when we're talking about slavery and when we're talking about colonialism, we understand how important these particular perceptions or consciousness is for people in terms of people joining the labor force. So you're getting people coming in from the Philippines and they're taking jobs that Caymanians would normally have, because the Caymanian is not going to act like the Filipino. And once the Filipino is here and got his status and all that, he's not going to act like that anyway. He going to act the way. So we don't teach our children in school how to be deceptive, how to role play, to play the role. Teach them how to play the role, because most of life is about misleading each other. I mean, it's not that society is a heaven, you know. So it is just to make them know, yes, you got to be able to play the role.
Can I say?
Thank you, Dr. Frank. Go ahead, Chris, last one.
So my question actually kind of follows into the last point you made about the children, but it also ties into some of the things. I think Latoya talked about it. You know, you talked about the school and what you didn't learn and what wasn't there. And Frankie talked about the psychology of it. And I just wanted to comment a bit on or ask a question as the panel of educators, whether by profession or by volunteer. You guys are all educators in a way. Do you guys see a benefit of educating the youth earlier, particularly in our history, in the Caymanian history, and maybe a bit about how receptive they are to it? Are they excited, or could they not care less, etc.? And do you think, to put on the end of that, do you think that some of the issues that you're having where there are Caymanians, like you said, Dr. Frank, talking about their wanting to be defiant, or they know where they're cosplaying, or whatever that last point was, do you think they would be more comfortable playing along if from a young age they were taught what it meant to be a Caymanian? So you feel more comfortable stepping out of your comfort zone when your core is stronger in what you are as a Caymanian. I know it's a loaded question, but
no. Let me go to the teacher first.
Okay, can you go first? I can. You sure? Okay. Thank you so much for that, Ethan. I have an issue, and maybe this is something that I have to work out with my therapist later on this week. I have an issue with this idea of role playing. I think it's really important, and I studied policy. That's what my master's was in. And for me, I do believe it's starting earlier. And I do believe that it centers around identity building. And I think when after the Roy Borden Symposium, I did a paper on education then. And one of the things when doing the research that stood out to me was the impact that all of these different inputs that the government can put in place, the one that really will determine how, or has the greater impact in determining how a student turns out at the end, is the inputs when it comes to early childhood. But even when you look at early childhood, we also then have to look at policies around family. How do we define family in the Caymanian society? And how do we provide support for families at all economical levels? And so for me, I don't believe in role playing. I feel like the only role I'm going to play is the role that I was put here to play, and it's me. And so I do think it's very important for us to start teaching our kids, our country about that from our earlier age. So really starting from the policy around what does early childhood looks like, but not only the early childhood aspect, what are the policies around how we support our families to make sure that they are in the position to assist what the teacher is doing at school, the inputs that the teacher is giving at school, at home as well. I think that's my take on that.
Thank you, Latoya, for that. Thank you, Ethan, for the question. And I'll speak from a student perspective because my teacher is here, Dr. Williams. I didn't have to go overseas to learn the history that I did, thankfully, because I got it here at UCCI. And so I started to make the connections early in my society, and I started to realize my own psychological response to some of the issues in our society, whether that was poverty, whether that was colorism, whether that was even just feeling that shame of being Caymanian. That's a real thing, because even the way you speak, you can feel discriminated against. And so that being in his classes made me feel empowered that, yes, I can be proud to be Caymanian. Yes, I can be proud of the way I speak and the way I carry myself, because I've been brainwashed almost into believing into certain societal expectations that are maybe more Eurocentric and more Western, but it just empowered me in my identity, and then it encouraged me and inspired me to want to empower others. And that's when I realized, okay, yes, I want to be a teacher. You know, I want to be an educator. I want to work with the youth because I want to empower others as well. So
well, I will say that Katlen was like my best student ever.
Hey.
I know that my other students aren't going to like that, but it's the truth. But does anyone remember that culture and heritage policy? I was actually a part of that. I think that was rolled out. It was shelved. So around 2016, it's not shelved. So last year there was some word, but I haven't heard anything. But in any case, I liked what they were doing, because I was a part of it. I was invited to be a part of it. And I remember there was great consensus around having a civics course and making that course mandatory, not only for the private schools, but for every school. And it's kind of sad that it kind of stopped. So I don't know what's going on with that.
Education.
Talk to education. Okay.
So to that point, So while within the Ministry of Youth, Sports and Heritage, we realize there's certain things that are beyond our control. So we have reached out to education, because ultimately it's up to them what curriculum and what books are used. So in the last year, the ministry has produced the National Heroes Day book. We also have another book called Freedom coming out within the next couple of weeks. So we're trying to fill that gap and that void that we know exists in the community within the schools as well. So we are slowly working away and trying to get it, chip away at it. So, through events such as this, Emancipation Day, the Emancipation exhibit, also identifying our national symbols, which we worked really hard on for the last year and a half to do that as well. So we have a lot more exciting things to do coming out the pipeline as well in the next couple of months. You'll hear more stuff coming out. But we've not shelved the culture policy. We take bits and pieces of it and we implement it to the best of our ability. But it also requires us working with partners.
I think I'm thankful that we got you to speak, because you were trying to hide from the mic for the most part. I think we should get out of here on that note. As you can see, my boss is with me now. I want to thank Miss Latoya Francis for joining us this evening, Miss Katlen Bush for joining us this evening, Dr. Frank, always a pleasure, a wealth of wisdom over here, and also Dr. Williams as well. To the audience, thank you guys for rocking with us for the last 2 hours. I hope it's been good for you. I want to encourage everyone to celebrate Emancipation Day. Take note of what's going on throughout the week. The good work from the Ministry of Youth, Tanissa, everyone, Teresa over there. I know you guys working hard behind the scenes. Team effort, yes, well played, team effort. You've been listening to the Link Up podcast. I won't do my usual spiel, but we thank you for your support. You know where to find us. You can find us on Instagram @PodLinkUp, or you can find us on YouTube. Also, remember to follow the Ministry of Youth, Sports and Culture, their Instagram page. You've been listening to the Link Up podcast.